Certain philosophers may claim that you cannot prove a negation, namely God's non-existence. But I would ask, how is it that you cannot prove the non-existence of something when by definition there's nothing there to prove? We do not need to prove a negative, especially when there is nothing present. Negation is self-evident by virtue of absence. It doesn't take a natural scientist to demonstrate objective reality. Negation or absence is obvious and indisputable, a plain truism. There's nothing there to predicate other than negation. The burden is in proving how there is something out of nothing, how there is when what appears or manifests is not, literally no thing. We do not even have a proper predication because we are positing concrete existence, not ideation, in the face of nothingness, a so-called hidden presence when there is salient absence. If the only thing that presents itself is absence, how can the predication of existence negate this apparent negation? In other words, if God is a predicate, or if God is predicated to be, yet is occluded, does this not beg the question of what constitutes the properties of existence? If anything, negation is the one thing that you can prove because nothing appears. The philosopher is never called upon to prove a negative, for the burden is on the one predicating existential affirmation, here God's so-called existence. The laws of induction and inference speak of reasonable and common sense ratios of probability to support likely conclusions based upon evidence some believers wish to categorically disqualify as truth or knowledge just because it does not yield absolute certainty. However, is that good justification to negate a negative, let alone a good reason to live one's life by, when there's no evidence, which is menacing, hence does not exist, to support such a supposition? Just because something cannot be proved with absolute certainty does not make it ipso facto false. Moreover, theists or deists would have us believe, because it's not certain that God cannot exist, it is at least equally certain that God exists. That's William James Craig. According to, William Lane Craig. According to this way of thinking, any concession to the limits of proving a negative provides proportional, if not equal, logical grounds for positing an affirmative, or an affirmation, which at most is an inference, and a poor one at that, based on a non sequitur, where the conclusions do not follow from the premises. This reasoning is further based on the value of abstract possibility, itself a mental construction, rather than on mere probability, as if the possible supersedes the probable, especially when there's no tangible data to warrant this leap to metaphysical heaven. Positing divine being to annul non-being, itself the negation of negation, is to privilege a lopsided logic that assertion itself cancels negation, when the assertion is a vacuous statement that lacks a present referential object, while the negative is self-evident by virtue of the fact of nothing being present, to reiterate the point. Rather than set the bar to zero as a mutual inference based on the laws of induction, the predication of the existence of an absent object does nothing to negate this apparent absence. I do not grant that the proposition of God's existence holds the same level of probability as the apparent nothingness of the mental object we are positing. And when philosophers are called upon to prove a negation, we wittingly revert to the proof from modus tollens, which I have back here. If P, then Q. Not Q, therefore not P. If P, God exists, then Q, God would not be absent. Q, God is not present, hence absent. Therefore P, God does not exist. Although this is a valid proof based on propositional logic, all one has to do is quibble with the premises to manipulate the desired outcome one wants. But here I'm appealing to empirical facts, or the empirical argument. God's lack of presence gives no evidence for God's existence. To quote the New Atheists, the absence of evidence is evidence of absence. Given that most knowledge claims and scientific discoveries are built upon induction and inference, only to be supported or refuted by empirical evidence, does it make logical sense to affirm the existence of a supreme being when no inductive or deductive support can be indubitably established by appeal to all available evidence? Since when does the criterion of absolute certainty garner the respect to warrant the negation of negation in favor of affirmative belief in asserting God exists, especially when there is evidence to the contrary, namely the absence of the very object in question? The burden of proof is on the one proclaiming existence, not on the one questioning whether something exists. Here, negation is self-evident because nothing is present, and in order for something to exist, it must appear in order for it to be. An assertion of predication is affirmative, but one has the burden of proof. What is it? Where is it? Why does it not stand out or manifest? A proposition is not proof of itself. Existence is not a predicate. It cannot be defined into actuality. Existence as a hypothetical construct cannot be assigned or unconditionally conferred being as if it is merely a logical statement that needs no actual proof or substantial demonstration. Just because you predicate something doesn't make it so. One cannot dismiss the request for spatial temporal location and subsistence when predicating something substantive, such as in the substantive verb to be. If we appeal to arguments that God is immaterial and incorporeal or non-temporal, outside of space and time, ethereal, eternal, and infinite, hence eluding all naturalistic indicators of experiential evidence, then we are positing the presupposition of a being that has never displayed its manifest existence. The premise itself is illegitimate, for there is nothing to predicate other than a missing object, pure nothingness. Here God becomes a hypothetical mental construct that is hypothesized or reified as a concrete subject, a person no less. If it is only in one's mind, then how can it be a real independent of mind? In other words, just because we think it does not make it extant reality. And most we can say is that mind as ideation posits a cognitive, hence mental object, as the subject matter of its predication. But we cannot ontologically justify the leap from internal ideation, even as coherent logical relata, to external actuality. At best, God is a hypothesis, an educated guess or speculative conjecture that is empirically unverifiable. Yet thoughts themselves are empirical, hence experiential, empirical phenomenon, and the parameters of their content and properties can be scientifically studied and objectively recognized. But with the God hypothesis, we have no empirical object other than a mental concept, which is not sufficient to justify, let alone establish, the existence of an autonomous object that inhabits a mind-independent metaphysical reality. A negation, on the contrary, has no onus because nothing is predicated. There is no interlocutor engaging a subject other than one's own mind. Therefore, an affirmative predication is, at best, a psychological object. If you assert that a negation does not provide proof of a possible or potential object to manifest, then by definition it does not currently exist, and the whole argument devolves into possible or potential futures that have not occurred, despite the presumption that you cannot rule out their possible future occurrence. But to me, this seems to be eluding the present condition of predication and actuality. Possibility is a mental occasion or instance of futurity, pure hypothetical abstraction, while actuality is real presence, not limited to a cognitive object of predication. The main problem in predicating God's existence independent of any tangible evidence is that it relies on a form of argumentation that attempts to deduce existence from the mere concept of existence. These a priori arguments do not rely on sense experience to lend any credibility to the form of argumentation, but rather on an analysis of concepts alone and their logical relations that pretentiously confer the domain of being to hypothetical objects of thought, which are held to be knowable independent of empirical encounters. Yet these conventions are confined to the domain of ideas. When we deliberate ontology, we must separate our conceptual schemes and what they designate from that which is truly extant. Predication and empirical reality are two different things. One is confined to mental operations, the other is to facts. It's generally known that Kant forcefully challenged the ontological argument by claiming that existence is not a property or a real predicate, namely that the proposition exists is not properly defining predicate of God. Because existential propositions are synthetic in nature, existence becomes a logical predicate when such judgments are contingently performed. In other words, the notion of existence is only meaningful when objects of experience substantiate the predication. A concept alone does not confer existence. It's impossible for my idea of God to contain any real properties a priori without an experiential correlate to ground my epistemic judgment that God actually exists as a real object or acquires existence outside of my concept alone. In other words, we cannot conclude that the exact object of my concept exists independent of empirical reality. Existential statements typically either affirm or deny that something exists. Positive existential statements assert existence, while negative existential statements negate existence. The existential statement, God does not exist, is therefore a negative one. But we must keep in mind, as I have just shown, that God is a concept and not an object. There are no good grounds to think of God as anything but an idea, for there is no counterpart in material reality that would substantiate God as an empirical object. Therefore, when theists speak of God as existing, they are in actuality referring to the concept of God as a psychic object. From this vantage point, there is a special relation that is said to exist in one's subjective mind, independent of the ontological, hence external, reality of the concept in question. Therefore, the God posit or introject can have different functional distributions in a person's psyche, dissociated from the ontological status of God as a real object, and may serve myriad psychological purposes. Perhaps, some would argue, this is a sufficient condition to exonerate the notion of God from the question of ontology. But the God function is still merely a mental relation. That is not a necessary condition adjudicating the question of the existence of God. If a mental relation is all that is justified to establish a communion with the divine, then this phenomenon can extend to practically anything, which potentially imports a whole host of other illusions and sundry problematics. Despite the fact that the God introject occupies psychical reality for billions of people, it nevertheless remains a mental construct fueled by conscious wish fulfillment and unconscious dynamics. As we have elucidated at most we can say is that any existential statement about God refers not to an ontological object, but to the concept of God. And all properties attributed to God are an instance assigned to the concept of God. As a result, following Frege's amplification of Kant, the predication of existence can neither be a first-order property nor a defining property of God. In short, to reiterate the point, existence is not a defining property or predicate of God. Richard Dawkins tells us that it is, quote, almost certain, end quote, that God does not exist based upon improbable statistical odds. But I would argue that the God hypothesis is not really an empirical question, because if it were, we've already had proof of God's non-existence via absentia, for God neither has manifested nor revealed itself directly. Evidence is the sine qua non, or gold standard, by which we base and derive our modern understanding of the world, a condition without which it could not be. If the God question was truly an empirical one, then science has already proven that God does not exist, for there is no evidence. The very notion of existence employs the predicate of identity, namely that something is. The empiricist criterion of reality is based on the premise of that which is, that which has presence or being, namely something actual. The is of existence, there is an existential instantiation. A representation and conceptual scheme of existence is further constructed based upon the mode in which an object presents itself, and our mental apparatus uses various existential quantifiers to distinguish among its attributes or qualities. But with the God assertion, we have the converse. A being is predicated to exist based on that which is not present, that which does not present itself. Although most sensible people can generally agree that the universe exists because it presents itself to us as a manifold of sense impressions, objects with mass and temporal locations, and natural processes that we are necessarily obliged to participate in and acknowledge as concretely real, the masses often show deference to illogic. But this should not dissuade us from the pursuit of sober truth, no matter how unsavory we find it. We accept the universe as part of our natural circumstances because we experientially sense it to be real and substantive, what we are thrown into as part of that which is given. So why should we not impose the same criterion on the question of God?